Good morning. We're so glad that you decided to join us today. Our mission here at the Northeast Church is to love God, grow deeper, and share Jesus. We hope that you see our values reflected in the way that we worship together today. Good morning. Today we're having our cookout, and so we're so thankful for all of our guests who are with us today. And if you can, we'd love for you to stay around, enjoy that food with us. We'll be going down on my left here, probably on your right, and exit and go down the hallway to the stairwell, through the stairwell following our services. We'll enjoy that time together in fellowship and have a cookout. We'd love to get to know you better and enjoy that time with you. Have you ever been on a trip where you've been traveling around, you've been in the car, you've got your phone going as your GPS, maybe listening to a podcast, and you look down and you realize your phone's about to die. And then once you know it, you forgot to pack a charger. And so you're thinking, what am I going to do? I'm on this trip, my phone's dying, maybe it's not even a trip, maybe you're just driving around town that day and you don't have time to go home in order to get your charger. And so what do? You run into maybe Walmart or a Dollar General and you pick up a very expensive, for what it is, charger. And then you'll take it, and of course, if it's an iPhone, it's never Apple supported. And you just buy it. You end up paying so much for this thing, and you know it's only going to last a few days. But you need a charger. And so you end up taking this cheap charger, you plug it into your phone, and you get going on with your day. But what always ends up happening? Right, you end up getting this notification, pops up on your phone and says, this accessory is not supported by this device. And then shortly after that, maybe a few hours, at best a day, the charger stops working. It stops giving power to your phone. And now you've paid way too much for this little cheap charger, and your phone's still dying, and you're in the situation you were before. What this illustration points to is the principle of a power source. And that's this, is that there is no power without the right power source. Right? You even look at all these different type of chargers. In fact, this is for my watch. This isn't even for a phone, right? You have all kinds of different chargers, all kinds of different power sources. And we know the principle is true that you've got to have the right power source in order to supply the power you need. Now, every coffee drinker knows this. That's why we supply it for you every Sunday morning, is that there's some of you can't get started with your day without your coffee. You need your power source. There's some people who just can't get the day started without breakfast. Like, when I wake up, I am not ready to eat. I need to be awake for like an hour or two before I go and eat something. There's some of you right away. You've got to get started. You've got to have breakfast. You've got to eat. Cassidy tends to be more like that, right? Because you need energy. You need sustenance. You need something to sustain you. Right? On a more serious note, our teachers know that kids don't do very well in school if they're not getting the proper diet, they're not getting their nutrients at home, if they're not being taken care of. Why? Because there's no power without the right power source. When you look around the world, look around people we know, we look around, we look in the mirror, we look at our own lives, we realize that every human being just wants life, right? Real, abundant, flourishing life where you have satisfaction, joy, you're thriving. Everybody wants that. We want humanity. We want to see other people flourishing around us. We want what is good for ourselves and good for other people. But the problem is, and this isn't a series, but as we kind of gave this allegory of a shed and the blank keys last week, is that we all try to figure out different ways in order to get that satisfaction, that power of life, of abundant life and blessing. And we go different ways about getting there. And the reality is that many times we fall short of finding the correct power source. We end up using cheap, ineffective, counterfeit ways of getting the power we need for a life of flourishing and a life of thriving. We go to the various sources of power in life. We look for life, satisfaction, joy, and beauty in so many different places, including work, money, security, the government, our hobbies, our passions, right? Even the good things in life, like our families, good experiences, good food, good drink, all those type of things that people turn to in order to find satisfaction, joy in life. And not just people, you and I. People like you and I, people like the person staring at you in the mirror each morning. As we're all on this journey in life to find what it means to live a true life of satisfaction and joy. And what we find out is some ways just don't work. They're not the correct power source. The accessory doesn't support the device, right? It's the wrong power source for what we're looking for. And this isn't a new problem. When you look throughout human history, you realize so many religions, so many different ways of living are rooted in this pursuit of life, joy, happiness, contentment, satisfaction. And they're just trying to bring about that outcome of having fulfillment in life. And so we're not the first ones to ask this question. And in fact, a man 2,000 years ago, named Jesus of Nazareth, he claimed to have an answer to that question as well. And this morning we're going to look at a text in John 15 in which Jesus talks about this pursuit. And he talks about how we can truly live this life of joy and contentment. Last week, again, not a series, but we looked at what it means to give up the other sources of power in life, to give up the other things that we strive to seek after in order to find joy and contentment, and what it takes to humble ourselves, get on our knees, and knock on the door, and Jesus will open it for us. And now this morning, I want to look at a text in John 15, 1 through 7. What does it mean to leave that shed and to walk out in a life with God and living the life God has called us to? So let's look at that together in John 15 as we look at verses 1 through 6 first, as this metaphor of the true vine, as Grady read for us just a moment ago. And first, in verse 1, it starts, Jesus says, I am the true vine. I am the true vine. Now, what would that have meant for the original hearers? What would that have meant for his disciples? You see, Israel was supposed to be the vine. Israel is supposed to be this sort of tree of life for the world that Paul even talks about, the Gentiles being grafted into the olive branch or the tree, right? That Israel is supposed to be this community that brings life to the world, that people could plug into and experience God, that they could come to him. You see it in like stories of Jonah, where Jonah was sent out to Nineveh and to another nation, and he was proclaimed the message of God, that they needed to repent. Right, that Israel was sort of this ambassador for God, this true vine, that people could understand what God was like. However, Israel, as we see in the Old Testament, failed to live up to that. And so what Jesus says, Jesus comes as the fulfillment of that, and he says, I am the true vine. And I'm told in depictions of what the temple would have been like, that if you can kind of see that up there at the top, that the crowning of the temple, that it's sort of this vine going around the temple to depict life, to depict flourishing, and what it meant that when people were coming to the temple, people were coming to God, that they were partaking into this maybe a sort of tree of life, this thing that would bear fruit, bring satisfaction, bring fulfillment as they were coming to him. And Jesus says, I am the vine. And here you have an image of Jesus as sort of this being the center of this tree, and his disciples coming and becoming the branches. But what we see is that it's not like a vine. Like when I think of a vine, I'm thinking of like in a jungle and having, vines that you would jump on and you'd swing from one tree to another. But that's not the depiction. Instead, he's thinking of more of a grapevine, as that would have been something more common to them. And when you look at the grapevine and what we understand as a tree or a tree of life, it's very similar. You sort of have this root system in the ground. It comes up as a trunk, and it looks like this little tree. And then the vines kind of come out, and they string over the various like wood structures that are set up to help it grow. And so my point is, we don't often associate this passage with what we understand of the tree of life, as you see throughout the Old Testament and you see in Revelation. But what I believe Jesus to be claiming, it's the same imagery. And as we have specific words for different types of trees and different type of plants, there wasn't as much diversity, and at least the way in which the Bible talks about trees. And so what I think Jesus is claiming is that I'm the vine. I'm the source of life for the world. You come to me to find fruit. And that's what I believe Jesus is claiming. And then he continues on in the metaphor. He says, and my Father is the gardener. In other words, my Father is the one who maintains the tree and goes about maintaining it and keeps it. Right? Adam and Eve were to keep the garden. Right? And here it says that God is the keeper of this garden. He's the keeper of the vine, keeper of the tree. And he goes on in verse 2, kind of maps out this metaphor, and he says, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. And while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. So the first thing I want to notice here is that the Father removes branches that do not bear fruit. And my understanding and kind of the way in which the agricultural thought of the day is that they did this. This was like a fall pruning of trees. Is that they would go through in the fall and they would remove the branches that didn't bear fruit in the vineyard. And they'd go and cut out the branches that had withered and they weren't producing anything. They were fruitless and weren't producing fruit. So this was sort of that fall cleaning, as we'll see, or fall cleaning up of the garden, maintaining and keeping it. And then the second thing we see in this passage is that the Father also prunes the branches that are bearing fruit so that they can bear more fruit. So there's this, and that's more of this sort of this spring cleaning that would take place, the spring pruning that would take place. Is that they would prune the branches so that, they cut away some of the sort of the crowded limbs or crowded fruit so that it could bear more fruit. It would have room to continue to grow. And so what we see here is that, yes, the Father removes branches that do not bear fruit, which we'll come to in just a moment, but the Father also prunes branches. And as we are the branches, he says, if you plug into me, you're connected to me and to the tree of life, right? That you are a branch. He says the Father prunes the branches. The Father prunes us so that we can bear more fruit. And to us, that might sound like a uncomfortable thing. Right? I thought this was supposed to bring joy. This was supposed to bring fulfillment. This was supposed to cause us to thrive. Why is he talking about something, a process that sounds uncomfortable? And what I think that Jesus is talking about here, he's talking about the process in which we grow as disciples. He says, you want life, you come to me. You connect to me. But that doesn't mean that everything's going to be comfortable. He said, because in order to grow, you need to be pruned. Right? The theologians would call this the process of sanctification, this process of becoming holy, this process of becoming more like God. He says, and that's a pruning process. But it's a good process. Because as we're pruned, as we're disciplined, and as we face challenges that cause us to grow, we become more like God, and we experience life more as he intended it to be. And so here he uses this word clean, and don't think necessarily of purity and sort of like the purity principles of the Old Testament, but think more of how you clean up a tree in order you cut away limbs here, you cut away extra leaves here so it can grow. He says, and you are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. That the word of God has this power as we come to it, and it convicts us. It sanctifies us. It causes us to see things that need to be removed from our life. It causes us to see areas in which we're not thriving. We're not being connected to Jesus in certain areas of our life. And in those areas, the Father's pruning. He's cutting those things away. And yes, it's a painful process, but ultimately it's so that we can thrive as he's called us to do. And in verse 4, he says, remain in me as I also remain in you. And no branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. And this is an important one for us to get. Because as much as perhaps this week we celebrate independence, and independence is a great thing. The gospel has a lot to say about freedom. But at the same time, when you come to Christ and you submit your life to him and confess him as king, it's also a dependence day for you. Is that you are proclaiming that I'm going to be totally dependent on Christ. That total autonomy is not a good thing in life. That we are called to be connected and dependent on the God who created us. And Jesus says, I'm the vine, and no branch can bear fruit outside of him. You can't do this on your own. You can't create this life that you're trying to create independent of Jesus. He says, ultimately, you will not bear fruit. No one can bear fruit outside of Jesus. And so the branch must remain in the vine. And continues on and says it again. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But then he reminds us And in a country where we live free and we live autonomous, we need to remember this because it speaks to our hearts, is that apart from me, you can do nothing. Because apart from him, we don't bear fruit. We find ourselves back in that empty shed. We are unable to live as God intended us to live, to thrive as God intended us to thrive. And then he continues on with this metaphor and kind of concludes it a bit here, and then he's going to explain it. But he says, if you do not remain in me, say, I'm independent of God. I don't need him. I don't need to continue to be plugged into the vine. It says, if you don't remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. And such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. And I find this metaphor for judgment really interesting here. Because we can look at God and say, what an angry God, that he would prune the bush and that he would throw away the branches. But in reality, what God is doing is simply observing what has happened and cleaning up the mess. Ultimately, it's not God proclaiming that we are not good, that we're fruitless, but instead we have unconnected ourselves from God. We've disconnected ourselves from God. And because of that, we've withered. And all judgment is God observing that we've withered. We've withered away because we've unconnected ourselves from him. And then he cleans up the mess so that the other branches can thrive. And then he continues on and he says in verses 7 through 17, he begins to explain this metaphor a bit and what he's really getting at in this metaphor. And he continues on in verse 7. He says, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. Now, of course, that's a principle. God is not a genie in the bottle. But what he's saying is, listen, the life you're looking for, where you are taken care of, you have all that you need in this life. He says, it's going to be there for you. It's not that God gives you 3 wishes and you can have whatever you want, but it's that God is there with you to take care of you, to listen to your needs when you have needs, and to be there and to work in your life when you call for him. He says, but as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. And what we see here is that the purpose here of what Jesus is talking about is to instruct the disciples to abide, remain, and live in Jesus. And the question is, what does that look like? Right? That's the truth. Jesus is saying this exclusively. Jesus has been really exclusive in how he's talked about this. He's saying, listen, if you don't remain in me, death's on the other side of that. Those are all the other areas in our life that we try to connect to, the other ways of thriving that we try to connect to. He says they're counterfeit. They're not going to provide you life. They just produce death. He says, but you need to remain in me in order to find life. Now, what does that look like? He continues on. He says, if you keep my commandments, you remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. Now, it'd be really easy to read this and to see some kind of legalistic sort of framework that, see, it's keep the commandments and God will love you. No, that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that when you're plugged into Jesus and you keep his commandments, his teachings, his way of life, that's a continuation of being plugged into him and being connected to him. That to be plugged into him isn't to just say, I believe in Jesus and to go on living your life. But to be plugged into Jesus is to be living the way of Jesus, to be walking according to his teachings, to be a disciple, to be learning from him day in and day out and learning what that looks like. And we're going to come to that the charge that he gives the disciples here. What is this big, what are the commands he calls us to carry out? But he says the results, when we totally commit ourselves to the ways and the teachings of Jesus, he says the results ultimately are disciples who produce fruit. In other words, the disciples who produce what they were looking for. They were looking for that which satisfies, looking for that which thrives, just as we all are. He says, in the results of being plugged into Jesus, walking after his ways, living according to his teachings, his way of life, he says, ultimately the result is fruit. It's thriving. It's life. It's abundance. It's blessings. He says in verse 8, he says, this is my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. And again, this isn't a legalistic framework where, oh, I've proved I'm his disciples because I've done X, Y, and Z. No, it's that you're so plugged into Jesus that people see the fruit of it in your life, that they can see what is growing from that and what is developing from the fact that Jesus is your teacher and you're his disciple. And it's actually producing good in your life, that you're being people of love, people of joy, people of goodness. And there's a question here, what does it mean to bear fruit? You know, a lot of times when I hear people talk about bearing fruit, we're talking about making disciples, right? You're multiplying. You're producing more people who also bear fruit. And okay, another way that I hear us talk about it is, of course, maybe reflecting on the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5 and 6. In having more love, more peace, more joy, more contentment, more self-control in our life. The more we're connected with Jesus, the more those things develop. We become more patient people, more kind people. You see the fruits in the life of disciples of Jesus. And then still more, we would say maybe I've heard people talk about the fruits of Jesus as being acts of service that we see, and some of those fruits of the Spirit kind of lived out in real, actual ways through actions and through our words. And the reality is, I think I lean towards it being more the fruits of the Spirit, but the reality is, I think that it's all three of those things. And Colin Cruz, his commentary on John, says, fruit here refers to the entire life and ministry of those who follow Jesus' teaching and experience his presence in their life through the Spirit. Is ultimately, it's every area of our life that Christ permeates every area of life. When we are plugged into him and we're truly plugged into him, he gets every fiber of our being, every area of our mind, every area of our life, every area of our actions, that Jesus permeates it and transforms it, resurrects it, and causes us to thrive when we truly give ourselves over to the way and the teachings of Jesus. Now, I said we would come to this point where we sort of define what the commands are. What are these commands we are to give ourselves over to? Because in churches like ours, there's been a lot of commands that we would say, we would talk about in the Old Testament, there were 613 laws, and that the Israelites would try to keep all of those laws. Well, I can tell you, in the churches I grew up in, we had way more than 613 laws that you had to keep. So what does it look like to keep the commandments of Jesus? And I think Jesus says this, as he sums it up like this. He says, my command. I mean, could he be any clearer than this? He says, my command is this. He says, keep my commands. What is it, Jesus? My command is this. Love each other as I have loved you. As Jesus modeled that in his life and the way he treated others and the way he interacted with others, and ultimately the way in which he gave of himself. And he continues on in verse 13, gives that as a bit of an illustration. He says, look, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And again, he reiterates, this is my command. Love each other. Now, that doesn't mean there's no other teachings of Jesus that we need to adhere to. But what it does mean is ultimately any command or any theological statement that does not lead us to further love of others, of God and of others, is to be suspect. Is that we're to examine teachings, we're to examine philosophies, or examine behaviors, and say, does this cause me to live into the command of Jesus to love? And if it doesn't, we need to examine it and perhaps set it aside, or realize it's not the ultimate emphasis of our faith, and give ourselves to the practices of Jesus that lead us to greater love, greater joy, greater self-control. Right? That the teachings of Jesus ultimately should bear fruit in our life. And anyone's theology that causes someone to be unjoyful, unkind, or rude ought to be suspect. And we ought to look at it and say, it's not producing the fruit it's supposed to be producing. Therefore, we need to examine it and look at it. And we look at our own theology, our own practice, we need to ask this question. Is it producing the fruit of Jesus in our life? If not, we need to examine it. Because those who produce fruit ultimately display love. And now this isn't one of those sermons where it's all about love, it's all about, kind of ooey-gooey, but it's actually living out the way of Jesus. It produces love. This is not a love that doesn't confront. It's not a love that doesn't deal with real issues in life, but it's a love that chooses to be kind, chooses self-control, chooses patience, even in difficult situations. And Jesus says, if you live this way, that connected to him, connected to his way, his teachings, connected to bearing fruit, he says, ultimately your joy will be complete. He says, I have told you this so that my joy might be in you and that your joy might be complete. In other words, he wants for us what we want in our life, which is fulfillment, satisfaction. He says the way to do so, the way to have your joy complete, your joy fully satisfied, is to be connected in him, to give yourself over to his teachings and see love bear its fruit in your life. And that's only done through being connected to Jesus. Something that John Piper says that I really like. He says that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. That is what Jesus is talking about here, I believe. Is that if we truly want to live a life that we live satisfied and God is glorified, it starts by being satisfied in Christ. That's what we are called to. That God will be glorified and your joy will be filled when we're connected to Jesus. And so here's kind of our point this morning. Our one thing to walk away with is that all people must be connected to Jesus in order to live fruitfully and joyfully. That doesn't mean other people don't have fruit in their lives and other people don't have joy in their life, but I mean this ultimately, is that if we want the ultimate fruit to be displayed in our life, we want the ultimate joy that is to be experienced in life, it starts with being connected by Jesus, or in Jesus. And the practical ways in which we do that is we devote ourselves to God in the spiritual disciplines. We make sure we're connected into a spiritual family who are also connected to that vine. That this is not an individual pursuit. It's a pursuit of the community. That we are all branches plugged into the vine. And we're all in this pursuit of living fruitfully and joyfully together. And then it also requires us to set aside the counterfeit ways of finding joy, the counterfeit ways of finding satisfaction in this life, and continuing. And that's a continuous process of pruning, removing the bad fruit in our life and continuing to allow room for God's fruit to be able to be produced in our lives. So if you're here this morning, you have a need, you'd like to come to Jesus today, confess him as Lord, confess him as King, submit yourself to him through the act of baptism. We would love to be here to celebrate that with you this morning. But maybe you're here and you already are a disciple of Jesus. And we're challenged by this as we find ourselves throughout life in these ebbs and flows, and we find ourselves sort of wandering away from God at times, wandering away from the vine and needing to connect ourselves back. Or maybe we just need to be pruned a bit to remove some of the bad fruit, the things that have been produced by searching for joy, searching for thriving in the wrong places. And you want to bring that before your brothers and sisters in Christ this morning. Or maybe you'd like to do so privately. You'd like to step into the prayer room on my right here through the back into the Kidman hallway and to sit down with one of our shepherds who can talk about some of those challenging areas this morning. But rest assured, although the pruning is uncomfortable at times, it leaves us room, leaves us margin in order to grow and to produce fruit like God intended us to. And behind that is joy, satisfaction, and flourishing. Thank you for coming this morning. I hope you'll join us now as we stand and while we sing. For taking time to participate in our worship today. We hope that you are leaving filled and ready to go out and to be a part of what God is doing in the world. If we can help you along your journey, we hope that you'll reach out to us. You can find out more information about the Northeast Church at www.northeastchurch.com.